Two women faced each other across a polished table, as if the studio itself had become a battlefield. On one side sat Jasmine Crockett, her hand resting on a closed folder, her gaze calm but unyielding, like a soldier who already knows the outcome of the fight. Opposite her, Melania Trump, draped in ivory and pearls, her smile delicate, her eyes unblinking, a porcelain mask hiding fractures no one was supposed to see. For 11 minutes, the cameras captured not just words, but a clash of worlds. Jasmine spoke of truth, of receipts, of ledgers power hoped to bury. Melania countered with poise, with dignity rehearsed 1,000 times. And then, the shift, a tremor in her voice, a blink too long, fingers tightening on glass. The confrontation no longer belonged to them. It belonged to every viewer holding their breath. Until finally, the mask broke. Silence. Then collapse. Before we dive deeper, remember this. What you are about to witness is a dramatization. Imagine scenes woven around real figures and familiar tensions. The details may be recrafted, but the emotions, betrayal, defiance, the cost of courage are drawn from truths we all know. Because sometimes fiction speaks the heart of reality louder than headlines ever could. So lean in. This is not just a story of a woman falling. It is the story of what happens when power and accountability meet face to face, and only one remains standing. Downtown Dallas at night always hummed with energy, but inside one particular studio, the air felt different. It wasn't the kind of buzz you get from live television, or the casual chatter of an audience waiting for entertainment. It was heavier, like a church right before the sermon begins, or a courtroom seconds before the verdict is read. Every breath, every shuffle of shoes against the polished floor seemed to carry the same silent message. Tonight will not be ordinary. Rows of chairs were filled with an audience that told its own story. Men with veteran pins on their lapels sat shoulder to shoulder with retired teachers, their hands folded as if back in a classroom. Church elders in neat suits murmured short prayers under their breath, while gray-haired women clutched their handbags close, eyes fixed on the stage. This wasn't a crowd-chasing spectacle. These were people who had lived through decades of promises, betrayals, wars, and movements. They had seen leaders rise and fall, and they had come here to witness if truth could still stand tall under bright lights. Behind the cameras, chaos was carefully disguised as professionalism. Makeup artists darted in and out, powdering foreheads that already gleamed with tension. A producer whispered furiously into a headset, glancing at the countdown clock as if it might explode. Clipboards shuffled. A stagehand tapped the microphone once, twice, then again, unable to hide the tremor in his hand. The usual smooth rhythm of television production had been replaced by an anxious staccato, as though even the staff understood they were about to document more than just another panel discussion. And then, the camera lights flicked on, washing the stage in a sterile glow. 3 seats, 3 figures, 3 very different worlds colliding at one polished, semicircular table. On the left sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. She wore a navy blazer with sharp white lapels, the kind of cut that made every line deliberate. Her hands rested lightly on the table, fingers interlaced, as though she was saving her energy for the exact moment it would be needed. She didn't fidget. She didn't scan the crowd. She simply stared straight ahead, her lips carrying the faintest suggestion of a smile. Not warmth, but certainty. It was the look of someone who had rehearsed not lines, but conviction. Across from her, in striking contrast, was Melania Trump, draped in ivory silk, pearls catching the light with every subtle movement. She embodied the elegance that had been her armor for years. Her posture was flawless, spine like a ruler, hands moving with slow precision as she adjusted her cuff. She took a sip of water without so much as a ripple in the glass. To anyone glancing quickly, she looked untouchable, the image of composure. But to those watching closely, the older veterans in the third row, the sharp-eyed journalists near the back, there was something else, a stiffness around the jaw, A pause, half a second too long, before setting the glass back down. Small cracks in porcelain. Between them sat Terrence Vann, a veteran broadcaster whose 30 years on air had taught him how to smooth storms, how to control a room with nothing but tone. But tonight, even he betrayed signs of strain. His hands shuffled index cards that didn't need shuffling. His smile stretched but never quite reached his eyes. When he cleared his throat, the microphone caught a rasp no producer could edit out. The countdown began. 10, 9, 8. A producer held up trembling fingers. The audience leaned forward in unison, like a single body. Phones were already lifted, red recording dots glowing like tiny watchful eyes. 7, 6, 5. The studio wasn't just charged, it was electric. Not with joy, not with excitement, but with the brittle energy of expectation. People weren't here to be entertained. They were here because they sensed something enormous was about to break. Something polished was about to crack. 4, 3, 2. Melania adjusted her pearl earring. Jasmine lowered her hand to the folder resting beside her chair. Terrence's eyes flicked toward the camera. 1. The light went red. The nation was watching, and in that instant, before a single word was spoken, everyone in the room knew. Tonight would not be forgotten. The first words belonged to Melania. Her voice was low, smooth, touched with that European cadence that once charmed millions. She thanked the audience, the host, the country itself, her tone even and practiced, the rhythm of someone who had been on stages her entire adult life. She spoke of dignity, of composure, of the burden of being endlessly photographed, analyzed, and picked apart. Privacy, she said softly, her accent curling around the syllables, is not a luxury. It is a human right. Heads in the audience tilted. Some nodded, sympathetic. Others frowned, sensing the defensive walls behind her gentle words. For a moment, it seemed she had set the tone. Calm, controlled, untouchable. But then the camera cut to Jasmine. No smile, no polite laughter, not even a token nod of agreement. She leaned forward slightly, her blazer catching the edge of the light, her eyes steady. People don't want theater, she said, her voice cutting clean through the studio air. They want facts, they want honesty, and most of all, they want receipts. The words landed with the weight of a gavel strike. A hush spread through the audience like a wave. A veteran in the front row straightened in his chair. A retired teacher's pen froze above her notepad. The silence was not empty. It was loaded, tense, the kind of silence that demands someone prove they can still breathe. The camera caught Melania at that exact second. A blink, barely a heartbeat, but long enough for every viewer at home to see a tiny crack in the porcelain mask. She adjusted her posture, lifted her chin higher, but the moment had already been preserved. One blink, one tremor, one glimpse of a woman who suddenly looked less invincible. The audience didn't move, but their bodies leaned forward as though they had collectively caught a scent in the air. Anticipation, maybe danger. Terrence, the moderator, tried to smooth the moment with a polite laugh, shuffling his cards as though to remind everyone this was still just television. "Let's stay constructive," he said, his voice thinner than usual. But no one was listening to him. Every pair of eyes was locked on the two women at the table, each now carrying themselves like duelists circling before the first strike. Melania lifted her glass, the pearls at her wrist shimmering under the light. She took a sip, her hands steady, her face composed again. "Theatrics," she murmured, her tone meant to dismiss, but the word felt heavier than she intended, as though she had admitted something without realizing it. Jasmine's gaze didn't falter. She let the silence hang, then leaned back in her chair, her hand drifting casually, almost too casually, onto the folder at her side. Leather, dark, unmarked, resting like a weapon waiting to be drawn. She didn't open it. Not yet, but the gesture was enough. The audience noticed. The cameras noticed. And Melania noticed most of all. A flash in her eyes betrayed it. Fear, or anger, or perhaps both. The clash had not yet begun, but everyone in the room understood the truth. It was coming, and when it did, it would not be polite. Terrence shuffled his cards again, buying time, though no one cared what was written on them. His voice tried to reclaim authority, polished and professional. Let's widen the lens here, shall we? We're here to discuss trust, leadership, the larger picture. He gestured with a practiced smile, but the room had already drifted away from him. The current was stronger than the host, stronger than the questions. The audience's eyes were fixed on Jasmine and Melania, two figures locked across a table, their silence louder than anything Terrence could manufacture. Melania adjusted her pearl earring, reclaiming her posture with surgical precision. Her lips pressed into the faintest curve of disdain, a look she had worn for decades without effort. Trust, she said, her voice velvety but sharp at the edges, is destroyed when people choose spectacle over dignity. When politics becomes theater, no one wins. The audience shifted, uncertain whether to nod or hold their breath. It was a well-delivered line, one that sounded safe, controlled. But Jasmine's reply cut through the studio like lightning in a summer sky. Her voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. Power hides behind photographs, she said, her tone measured but deadly. And I'm prepared to show what's behind the frame. The words detonated in the silence. A gasp escaped the audience, not loud, but collective, like an intake of air too sudden to control. In the back rows, phones came up instantly, red dots flashing as dozens began to record. A veteran muttered something under his breath. A woman clutched her husband's hand. In that instant, the studio had transformed, no longer an audience, but witnesses. The camera caught Melania's reaction in brutal close-up, a flicker in her eyes, a tightening around her mouth. For the first time all evening, she looked away, not at Jasmine, not at Terrence, but toward the shadows where her aides sat frozen. It was only a second, but seconds were all the internet ever needed. Terrence leaned forward, desperate to keep control. Congresswoman, let's be clear. Are you accusing Mrs. Trump directly of misleading the public? His voice strained, bordering on plea. Jasmine didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed locked on Melania. She leaned back slightly, a subtle shift that somehow radiated control, and rested her hand on the folder at her side. Her thumb tapped it once, deliberately, like a warning. I'll give you a chance, she said evenly. A chance to own your story. Because once I open this, it won't belong to me anymore. It will belong to the American people. The weight of that promise dragged the room into silence. The kind of silence that makes hearts pound louder in ears. That makes cameras zoom tighter. That makes every witness wonder if they are about to see something irreversible. Melania's jaw clenched, but no words came. The red light on the camera burned brighter. Phones tilted higher. Breath caught in throats. The storm had not yet broken, but its shadow already covered the room. And everyone knew, whatever happened next, there would be no going back. Terrence straightened in his chair, forcing his voice into the microphone with the weight of experience. Let's bring this back to the question Americans care about most, he said, glancing at his cards, though the words had already been etched in his mind. What builds or destroys public trust in our leaders? His tone carried authority, but beneath it, a tremor betrayed his urgency. He wasn't just moderating anymore. He was trying to wrestle back control from a storm that was already forming. Melania's head tilted slightly, pearls brushing against the collar of her ivory dress. She folded her hands neatly on the table, the picture of composure. When she spoke, her voice was smooth, low, and carefully measured, every word carrying the weight of someone used to being studied and dissected. Public trust, she began, is fragile. It is built on consistency, on dignity, on restraint in the face of constant provocation. For years, I have lived under relentless media distortion, headlines twisted to suit agendas, cameras following my every move. And yet I have carried myself with grace, because sacrifice is the price of service. Her words floated into the studio, polished and elegant. In the front row, a church elder nodded thoughtfully. A retired school teacher scribbled a note, perhaps impressed by the poise. To many, Melania's reply sounded like the kind of wisdom America wanted to hear, measured, composed, steady in the storm. But Jasmine didn't nod. She didn't smile. She waited until the applause of silence faded, then leaned forward slightly, her eyes sharp, her hands still. "Privacy is a right," she said, her voice steady but cutting through the room like a blade. "But not when it's bought at the cost of public truth." The words hit the air hard, not loud, but undeniable. They didn't soar. They landed. The audience reacted not with murmurs or applause, but with stillness, as though every person in the room had been pulled taut like a wire. A veteran shifted in his seat. Someone in the back gasped quietly, then immediately covered their mouth. The camera zoomed in on Melania's face. For a moment, she looked untouched. But then came the flicker, a blink held just a fraction too long, a muscle tightening at the corner of her jaw. It was nothing a casual viewer might notice, but those in the studio saw it, and so did the millions who would later rewind, pause, and replay. The first crack in porcelain was there. Terrence tried to intervene, his voice almost too quick. "So, Congresswoman, you believe that privacy—" But Jasmine didn't allow him the chance to dilute her point. She leaned back, her blazer crisp under the lights, her eyes locked on Melania, not the moderator. "Americans are not tired of sacrifice," she continued. "They are tired of facades. They are tired of images curated to hide what's real. Trust is not protected by silence, it is destroyed by it." The audience did not move. The silence was darker now, heavier, as if the studio itself understood it had become something more than a stage. The conversation wasn't drifting toward conflict anymore. It was already there, and every person in that room knew. Trust was no longer just a topic. It was the battlefield. Jasmine let the silence linger just long enough to feel uncomfortable, then leaned forward, her voice calm but sharper than glass. "Let's not pretend this is theoretical," she said, her hand resting lightly on the leather folder at her side. "We can start with Zurich, March 11th. The room shifted instantly. You could hear the scrape of a chair leg, the sudden intake of breath from someone in the third row. A murmur ran like static through the audience. Phones tilted higher, thumbs pressed harder against record buttons. The name of a city, the certainty of a date, it was no longer rhetoric. It was a blade being unsheathed. Melania didn't flinch outwardly, but something subtle changed. Her shoulders stiffened, her posture a fraction too rigid, as though every muscle in her body had been ordered not to betray her. She smoothed the hem of her dress, lifted her chin, and spoke with a voice still honeyed, but thinner now, less effortless. "Initials," she said slowly, "do not prove identity. Anyone can write letters. Anyone can pretend to be someone they are not." Her words were careful, deliberate, meant to create doubt. But Jasmine didn't even blink. She leaned back in her chair, allowing a thin pause, then dropped her reply with surgical precision. "Then why," she asked evenly, "is your name written, clearly, unmistakably, in the hotel's handwritten guest log?" It was like a thunderclap in the room. The audience gasped collectively, sharp and immediate, like a single voice. Whispers erupted, rippling through the rows in quick, frantic waves. A church elder shook his head slowly, whispering, "Lord have mercy." A journalist scribbled furiously in the margin of his notebook, underlining Zurich twice. The camera cut close on Melania, her lips pressed into a line, the kind of line that holds words hostage. For one fraction of a second, her eyes darted toward the control booth, toward her aides frozen in the shadows. It was a tiny betrayal of the mask she wore, but the cameras caught it. They always did. Terrence jumped in, panic flashing behind his polished smile. Let's broaden this discussion, he stammered, shuffling his cards so loudly the microphone picked it up. The larger issue here is, the role of media narratives in shaping public perception. His voice rose with artificial energy, the desperate tone of a man trying to wrestle a wildfire back into a candle. But it was too late. The words Zurich and March 11th hung in the air like smoke you couldn't clear. The audience wasn't following the moderator anymore. Their bodies leaned forward, their eyes fixed on Jasmine, waiting for the next strike. Even the crew behind the cameras had stopped moving, as if they too understood the line had been crossed. Melania sat tall, her pearls gleaming under the lights, her expression carved into something close to defiance. But her stillness no longer felt like control. It felt like survival. And Jasmine hadn't even opened the folder yet. Jasmine's fingers tapped the folder once, the sound small but sharp, like the ticking of a clock. She didn't open it, not yet. The restraint was deliberate, almost cruel in its precision. The folder sat there like a loaded weapon, every audience member aware of the power it contained. Her calm was the unnerving kind, the calm of someone who had already measured the distance to her target. When she finally spoke, her words were as steady as her hands. Zurich wasn't the only entry, she said. We could also talk about Marbella, April 6th. The reaction was immediate. A ripple tore through the crowd, louder this time, more urgent. Chairs creaked as people leaned forward. Someone whispered, "She's got more," and the phrase darted across the studio like a current. Phones tilted higher, catching every breath, every flicker of expression. The camera zoomed tight on Melania. Her face remained composed, but her voice betrayed her. "You're walking a dangerous line," she said, the words trembling at the edges no matter how carefully she shaped them. Jasmine's reply came like iron wrapped in velvet. "No," she said, leaning forward, her eyes locked on Melania's. "I'm walking the truth, and it's paved with timestamps." The audience gasped, a low wave that built and broke in a collective exhale. Whispers turned into murmurs, murmurs into hurried commentary. A retired teacher scribbled furiously on her notepad. A veteran in the front row muttered, "She's got her cornered." The sound in the studio was no longer silence. It was anticipation, pulsing and alive. Terrence tried again to steer the ship, his voice rising above the noise. Let's remember this is still a discussion of principles, of leadership, of how trust is built." But his words dissolved before they reached the back row. No one was listening. The gravity of Jasmine's statement had shifted the ground beneath them all. Melania adjusted her posture, lifting her chin higher, gripping the edge of the table as though it might anchor her. "You're making accusations," she said slowly, forcing steadiness into her tone. "Dangerous accusations? Do you understand what that means?" Jasmine didn't blink. Her hand stayed on the folder, her thumb tracing the edge as though reminding Melania what remained sealed inside. "It means," she said, "that I came prepared, and I don't bluff." The words settled into the room like a verdict. The audience exchanged glances, their eyes wide, their phones steady. They understood now. This wasn't speculation, wasn't theater, wasn't a guessing game. Jasmine had receipts, and the weight of them was already pressing down on the polished table between them. Melania's lips parted as if to reply, but no sound came. The studio's silence returned, heavier than before, thick with the knowledge that the storm had only just begun. And for the first time, even her strongest supporters felt it in their bones. Jasmine Crockett wasn't threatening. She was promising. For a long moment, the table between them seemed to glow under the lights, as if the air itself were hot enough to burn. Melania's face remained carved in composure, but when she spoke, her words cut sharper than her expression. "This," she said, each syllable measured, "is nothing but a smear campaign, attention-seeking, sensationalism, the kind of thing people do when they crave the spotlight more than the truth. The audience reacted with a stir of movement. A retired soldier in the second row leaned back, crossing his arms, his jaw tightening. A woman in a blue cardigan whispered to her neighbor, her voice just audible enough to carry, "She's lashing out." Phones tilted higher, their red lights glowing like fireflies in the dark. The studio wasn't just watching anymore. It was recording history in real time. Jasmine didn't flinch. Her eyes didn't even flicker toward the host or the audience. She leaned back slightly, letting Melania's words settle into the space, letting them breathe long enough to feel hollow. Then she spoke, calm as stone. "If it's a lie," she said evenly, "sue me." The silence that followed was like a wall slamming down, heavy, immovable. The kind of silence that wasn't absence of sound, but the presence of something larger than words. A collective shiver moved through the room. One man coughed once, then thought better of it. The cameras stayed locked, zooming in close on the two women, their faces etched against each other like portraits of war. Melania's lips pressed tight, the pearls at her ears trembling with the faintest movement of her head. Her hand adjusted the glass of water in front of her, though she didn't drink. For the first time all evening, her poise seemed fragile, as if the weight of the line had landed heavier than she had expected. Terrence Van, the veteran moderator, tried to step in. His hands shuffled the cards before him so fast they bent under the pressure. He forced a laugh, but it came out thin, strained, like glass cracking under heat. "Well, let's remember we are here to discuss leadership, values, what it means to build bridges." He stopped mid-sentence, realizing the words were falling flat. His throat bobbed, sweat gleaming at his temple under the merciless studio lights. The cards trembled in his hand, betraying the nerves his voice could no longer hide. But the audience wasn't looking at him. They weren't even breathing in his direction. Every gaze was locked on Jasmine, who had just delivered a challenge so stark, so irreversible, it seemed to tilt the ground beneath the room. Melania sat taller, gathering what dignity she could, but her voice faltered on the edges, thin threads straining to hold a mask in place. "You think you can destroy a reputation with half-truths?" she asked. Jasmine's reply came like a verdict. "I don't destroy reputations. I expose them." The silence thickened again, heavier than any shouting match could ever be. The audience leaned forward in unison, knowing they had just crossed a threshold from which there was no return. It happened slowly, almost too slowly to comprehend at first. Melania's hand, resting near the glass of water, trembled ever so slightly. The pearls at her wrist shifted, catching the studio light. At first, it seemed like nothing more than fatigue, the kind of nervous shake that comes when you've been under hot lights for too long. But then her fingers slipped against the stem of the glass, and the water inside rippled, betraying the truth. She straightened in her chair, as though willing her body back into command, but her shoulders betrayed her. The slightest sway, subtle enough to make the audience lean forward in confusion. Her other hand reached for the armrest, fingers brushing chrome, but missing by an inch. The studio, so loud with silence before, now seemed to breathe in one collective gasp. Jasmine didn't move. Her eyes stayed locked, her expression frozen in that uncanny calm. The folder remained untouched at her side. Melania tried again, this time reaching for the back of her chair, but her grip faltered. The pearl bracelet slid against her skin. For a split second, she looked suspended, upright but weightless, as if gravity itself was deciding her fate. Then, with a shudder, her body tipped. First her shoulder dipped, then her elbow buckled, and finally her knees gave way beneath her. It wasn't dramatic, not theatrical. It was far worse than that. It was slow, human, terrifying in its inevitability. Her lapel mic popped with static as she tilted sideways, catching nothing but air. Gasps tore through the audience, sharp and panicked. Someone shouted, "Help her!" Another voice screamed from the back. A producer, off stage, bolted forward, but too late. Melania's body folded toward the ground, her knees striking first with a dull thud that echoed louder than any applause ever had. The studio erupted. EMTs, who had been stationed just out of sight as a precaution, rushed in with alarming speed. Their voices were clipped, urgent, commanding. "Clear space! Move now!" Chairs scraped as stagehands cleared a path. The cameras, still live, caught every angle. Melania's ivory dress against the dark floor, the way her hair fell forward, the frantic hands lifting her shoulders. The audience was frozen. Some covered their mouths, others clutched their chests. A retired soldier whispered a prayer under his breath, his voice shaking. Teachers, elders, journalists, all of them sat paralyzed, their eyes wide, their phones still raised, unable to decide whether to keep filming or drop them in shock. And beyond the walls of the studio, millions were watching live. In living rooms from Ohio to Arizona, in diners and barbershops, in quiet suburban homes, the image was broadcast unedited. Melania Trump collapsing under the weight of a truth not yet fully spoken. For years, she had been an image, elegant, untouchable, preserved like fine porcelain. But in those seconds, that image shattered. Not with scandalous words or angry shouts, but with the undeniable frailty of a body buckling under pressure. The symbolism was merciless. A persona cultivated over decades crumbled in the span of a single fall, and once porcelain cracks, it can never be made whole again. The studio erupted into a storm of movement. Stagehands rushed forward, producers barked orders into headsets, and EMTs worked with clinical urgency. Chairs scraped, audience members gasped, and someone near the back screamed for water, though none was needed. The polished set, built for order and decorum, had collapsed into chaos in less than a minute. Yet the cameras were still rolling. Millions of Americans saw it unfold in real time, and millions more were already replaying it on their phones. Within seconds, the internet had claimed the moment. Twitter feeds lit up with hashtags climbing at breathtaking speed. Rars Melania collapse shot to #1 in the U.S. in under 5 minutes. Crockett exposes wasn't far behind. Clips of the fall spread faster than producers could cut the live feed. On TikTok, edits surfaced almost instantly. "Watch her face when Jasmine says Zurich." One video caption read, with a slow-motion replay of Melania's blink just before the collapse. Another showed side-by-side footage of Jasmine's hand tapping the folder, synced with dramatic music. The views poured in by the millions, phones buzzing in kitchens, bars, and late-night diners across the country. Newsrooms scrambled. Anchors interrupted scheduled segments, voices tight with urgency. "We're receiving reports from Dallas. Former First Lady Melania Trump has collapsed during a live broadcast." Producers fumbled through scripts while analysts demanded confirmation. The chaos in the studio was mirrored by chaos in every newsroom. Wires humming, teleprompters rewritten, editors shouting across news floors. Back inside the Dallas studio, the air had turned heavy, almost suffocating. The audience remained glued to their seats, paralyzed between shock and disbelief. Some still held up their phones, filming through trembling hands. Others lowered their devices slowly, guilt washing over them as they realized they were capturing not just scandal, but a human body in distress. And through it all, Jasmine Crockett sat perfectly still. She did not stand. She did not reach for the microphone. She did not raise her voice or her folder. Her calm presence, unshaken by the chaos, became its own kind of spectacle. Reporters would later describe her expression as unreadable, like a statue carved from resolve. She neither celebrated nor retreated. She simply remained. It was her silence that stunned most of all. While hashtags exploded, while headlines screamed, while producers spun narratives, Jasmine said nothing. No tweet, no press statement, no triumphant remark. The folder at her side stayed closed, untouched, as if she was daring the world to notice what was already in motion. By the time EMTs wheeled Melania out of the building, Escorted by frantic aides, the internet had already turned the collapse into a symbol. Some called it justice, others cried conspiracy, but everyone agreed something had shifted in those 11 minutes. And in the eye of that storm, Jasmine Crockett's silence spoke louder than any victory speech ever could. By dawn, the story had consumed everything. Overnight, 8 million Google searches carried one name, Jasmine Crockett. Her face, frozen in screenshots from the broadcast, stared out from phone screens and laptop monitors across the country. The image varied depending on who shared it. Some showed her hand poised on the folder, like a judge ready to deliver a verdict. Others caught her expressionless gaze while Melania buckled beside her. But in every version, she was there, calm, unshaken. The still point in a storm the entire nation couldn't stop replaying. The public split almost instantly. On Twitter, one thread racked up 500,000 likes in just a few hours. She didn't shout, she didn't gloat, she just let the truth sit in the air, and it crushed the silence around her. Supporters called her courageous, disciplined, a woman who exposed power without theatrics. Facebook groups lit up with posts praising her restraint. Grandmothers in church circles sharing her line about receipts like scripture. College students clipped her stare into memes tagged, "One unbothered truth." But on the other side, condemnation rose just as fast. Conservative commentators accused her of political assassination, of exploiting another woman's collapse for career gain. One late-night host sneered, "If she wanted to be famous, congratulations, she just destroyed the First Lady on live TV." Calls for investigations into her conduct spread through certain corners of the internet. Some argued it was beyond politics, that she had violated basic decency by striking so personally. The divide ran deepest among older Americans, the very demographic who had filled the Dallas studio that night. In small towns and suburbs, dinner tables hummed with arguments. Some retirees felt betrayed. She humiliated another woman for applause. One caller told a Texas radio station, "That's not leadership, it's cruelty." In the same broadcast, another caller countered, "No, what's cruel is lying to a nation for years." Jasmine just refused to look away. At church breakfast in the Midwest, congregations lingered over coffee, debating whether Jasmine had crossed a sacred line or defended a sacred principle. Veterans who admired discipline admitted grudging respect for her composure, even if they disagreed with her politics. Teachers who had raised generations of students argued she modeled something rare, accountability that didn't require rage. Cable news turned it into spectacle. Panels of experts dissecting every second of footage. Psychologists analyzed Melania's body language, while political strategists parsed Jasmine's silence. Analysts pointed out how unusual it was for a rising lawmaker to stay off social media during such a storm. "She's letting the silence work for her," one said, "and silence can be louder than any speech." By noon, hashtags were no longer just trending, they were shaping the national conversation. Melania Collapse and Crockett Exposes fought for the top spot, joined by a third tag, "Different Receipts Matter." What began as a single televised panel was now a cultural moment, a referendum on truth, power, and what the public believed leadership should look like. And as the country argued, as millions refreshed their feeds, one thing became unmistakable. Jasmine's name was no longer just on a ballot in Texas, it was on the lips of an entire nation. The internet had barely settled into its morning rhythm when the first leak surfaced. At 5:42 a.m., a freelance journalist in Phoenix opened an email from an encrypted account with no name, no signature, just a subject line that read, "Zurich, Marbella." She wasn't alone. Attached were 2 PDFs, blurred at the edges, watermarked with faint digital fingerprints. The body of the email was short, a single instruction typed in plain text. "Verify the headers, check the manifests, the truth is there." Within minutes, the documents spread like wildfire across encrypted chat rooms and news Slack channels. One file contained a March 11th Zurich itinerary, complete with flight logs, customs entries, and a notation in bold, "Keep her name off the manifest." The other detailed an April 6th Marbella trip, a shadow itinerary stamped with timestamps and initials that lined up uncomfortably well with Jasmine Crockett's pointed words. For journalists trained to sniff out fraud, the first instinct was skepticism. But as the headers were run through forensic checks, a different picture began to form. The timestamps matched real customs records. The digital trails connected back to airports that had long, verifiable histories. Metadata showed no signs of tampering. It wasn't rumor anymore. It was a paper trail. By 7:15 a.m., CNN's newsroom was on fire. Producers leaned over desks, shouting for verification, their anchors being prepped with hastily written scripts. "We can't run this until we're sure," one editor barked, his coffee forgotten at his elbow. But another voice, calm and certain, answered, "The headers are clean. This is real." By 7:42 a.m., Reuters broke the first headline. Encrypted emails suggest undisclosed travel by former First Lady. At nearly the same moment, Politico published a parallel report, cautious but unmistakable. New leaks raise questions about Melania's international engagements. The ripple effect was instant. Morning talk shows scrapped their planned segments. Radio hosts abandoned weather reports mid-sentence. Twitter feeds swarmed with screenshots of the phrase that struck like a hammer: "Keep her name off the manifest." For many, it was the four words that stripped away any illusion of coincidence. In living rooms across the country, people who had watched the collapse the night before now leaned closer to their screens. Older Americans, who still trusted the weight of documents more than the noise of social media, studied the blurry PDFs with narrowed eyes. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others whispered to spouses in kitchens and diners. She wasn't making it up. She had it the whole time. Inside the Dallas studio, where technicians were still sweeping cables from the chaos of the night before, Jasmine remained silent. Her phone buzzed relentlessly, missed calls from reporters, texts from allies, voicemails stacking by the minute. She ignored them all. She didn't need to speak. The leaks were speaking for her. By mid-morning, the story was no longer about one woman's collapse. It was about the architecture of secrecy unraveling piece by piece, page by page, and the nation, hooked and restless, was beginning to realize Jasmine's folder might not be the only place the receipts had been kept. By late afternoon, the world didn't need PDFs anymore. It had moving images. The footage first appeared on a small European investigative site, uploaded without warning, buried in a generic article titled "Zurich Hotel Logs Under Review." But it wasn't the article that detonated, it was the embedded clip. The video lasted only 12 seconds. Grainy, time-stamped in the corner. It showed the interior of a Swiss hotel elevator. The doors slid open, and a tall figure stepped inside. The camera quality was poor, but some details cut through the haze with startling clarity. The sharp posture, the long beige coat, the distinct angular handbag carried in the crook of her elbow, a scarf tucked with exactness. Even blurred, the silhouette was unmistakable. It was Melania. Social media froze for a heartbeat, then erupted. On Twitter, hashtags shifted instantly from "das just if true" to "das there she is." On Facebook, older Americans replayed the clip in disbelief, typing long comments about posture, about how some things, carriage, presence, cannot be faked. On TikTok, younger users looped the 12 seconds, zooming in on frames, overlaying music, and stamping captions. "This isn't rumor, this is footage." CNN ran it at the top of the hour, looping the video with analysts pausing every second, circling the handbag, freezing the frame as the scarf caught the light. "The resolution is poor," one expert said, "but when you line this against verified appearances from the same season, the coat, the bag, the hairline, it's an exact match." Reuters simply captioned it, "From Zurich," with no denials yet. The impact was seismic. Overnight debates that had raged about whether Jasmine's folder was real, whether the emails were forged, suddenly felt quaint. The public wasn't parsing rumor anymore. They were looking at receipts, moving, breathing, time-stamped receipts. For Jasmine, it was a strange kind of silence. She had nothing to add, no press release, no fiery follow-up. In fact, the footage felt like a hand being taken from hers. What had begun as her lonely fight in a Dallas studio was now unspooling far beyond her control. Truth had grown legs of its own. By evening, commentators were no longer asking if the trips had happened. They were asking why. Why the secrecy? Why the deliberate erasure from manifests? Why the careful instruction to keep her name hidden? The story was no longer about Jasmine's courage. It had mutated into something larger, an international question of transparency and betrayal. And that was the twist. Jasmine's role, once central, was already being reframed. She wasn't the source anymore. She was the spark. Now, the flames were fanned by evidence, by timestamps, by elevator doors opening and closing in endless loops on millions of screens. For the first time in days, Jasmine allowed herself a deep breath. The weight had shifted. She no longer had to carry the truth. It was carrying itself. The elevator footage might have lit the fire, but the whistleblower poured gasoline on it. Her name was Colette Baines. For nearly 15 years, she had worked in the shadows as a liaison for private clients moving between Europe and the United States. She was no celebrity, no politician, no activist, just the kind of professional who kept other people's secrets tidy and invisible. But on this night, she was done keeping them. The first hint came through an anonymous message to a London journalist. She didn't book through her own name, ask about shell companies, ask about me, Colette Baines. Hours later, Colette appeared on camera, sitting in a small apartment with blinds drawn tight. The interview wasn't glossy or rehearsed. It was raw. Her voice was steady but worn, her face calm but tired. Viewers leaned in. She carried the weight of someone who had held silence for too long. "I arranged the travel," she said, almost clinically. "Zurich, Marbella. The Mediterranean stops. It wasn't under Melania Trump. It was through shell companies. That was the instruction. Keep her name off every manifest." The line landed like a gavel strike. Journalists didn't need to sensationalize it. The clarity was its own drama. She didn't shout, didn't posture. She simply explained the process, layering bookings through fronts, rerouting payments through subsidiaries, assigning initials instead of names. Each detail sounded less like speculation and more like the confession of someone unburdening herself after years of complicity. And people believed her. Instantly, across the internet, disbelief flipped into fury. Twitter threads exploded, filled with screenshots of the interview. Facebook timelines churned with comments from older viewers who recognized something in her weary cadence. Honesty. That's a woman who's telling the truth. One post read, gathering tens of thousands of shares. On TikTok, creators spliced her quotes with the grainy elevator clip, captioning it, "Paper trail meets footsteps." CNN replayed the segment on loop, anchors pausing on her face. "Notice her tone," one analyst observed. "This is not someone seeking attention. This is someone relieved to finally speak." Even skeptical outlets admitted the testimony carried a certain undeniability. Reuters called it the first credible human account linking the leaked documents to live logistics. The eruption was immediate and global. Stock tickers scrolled headlines mid-broadcast. European outlets pulled at the threads of those shell companies, tracing addresses to anonymous offices in Luxembourg and the Cayman Islands. Every new fragment reinforced her statement. For Jasmine, watching from her kitchen table with a mug of untouched coffee, the moment was surreal. The burden that had nearly crushed her career weeks earlier was now being carried by another voice, an insider. And unlike Jasmine, Colette wasn't fighting for political survival. She was fighting for peace of mind. That distinction mattered. The public didn't see Colette as partisan. They saw her as tired, ordinary, real. And sometimes it's the quiet testimony, not the fiery speech, that topples the tallest walls. By midnight, one headline summed it up with brutal simplicity: she spoke. We believed. When Colette Baines spoke, she didn't just open her mouth, she opened a door. And once it creaked, others began to step through. Within 48 hours, whispers multiplied. Former aides, chauffeurs, assistants, people who once signed airtight NDAs, suddenly began off-the-record conversations with reporters. Some spoke in shadows, voices disguised, names withheld. But the substance was unmistakable. Colette wasn't alone. One former staffer described a chain of ghost bookings where travel agencies billed to shell corporations that had nothing to do with airlines or hotels. Another explained that the secrecy wasn't just about protecting a first lady's privacy. It was about hiding the source of money. It looked personal, he said quietly, but it smelled political. The pattern sharpened. Investigative desks began cross-referencing the shell company names with government databases. That's when the dots started connecting. Dots no one expected. Shell Company A had once secured a mid-level contract for bridge renovations in Florida. Shell Company B appeared in filings linked to overseas energy consultancies. Another, obscure on paper, shared a director with a firm bidding for infrastructure projects along the Gulf Coast. This wasn't just about a wife sneaking away. It looked like a mechanism, a system. By the weekend, cable news panels stopped debating affair or no affair. Instead, the language shifted. Analysts explained something far darker: influence brokering. The scandal has left the bedroom. One political economist declared, "It has entered the boardroom, and that's where it becomes lethal." The word echoed across the airwaves. Influence. Not sex. Not scandal as soap opera, but scandal as structural rot. Charts began filling screens. Flow diagrams showing how shell companies insulated contracts from oversight. How influence could be traded like currency. A late-night host quipped grimly, "Turns out the elevator wasn't the real smoking gun. The invoices were." For ordinary Americans watching, the shift was jarring. Many had rolled their eyes at gossip about personal indiscretions, but highways, bridges, ports, these were tangible. This was about tax dollars. This was about power stitched into the fabric of daily life. One viral comment captured the new mood. "I don't care who she loved. I care who paid and what they got in return." Tens of thousands liked and shared it. The dominoes kept falling. Journalists unearthed archived emails that hinted at lobbying networks concealed behind social events. A hotel invoice that once seemed like trivial cover now looked like part of a sophisticated ledger. And Jasmine, watching all of this unfold, realized the story had officially outgrown her. What began as her fragile, lonely fight for credibility was now a public reckoning, fueled by forces she could no longer direct. She wasn't the conductor anymore. She was one violin in an orchestra roaring to life. The scandal had shifted shape. It was no longer about whispers in a classroom or rumors in a tabloid. It had become something systemic, something structural. The kind of scandal that didn't just take down reputations, it reshaped governments. The dominoes had only begun to fall. The envelope arrived just past dawn, slid under Jasmine Crockett's apartment door with the precision of someone who knew she would be awake. She didn't need to open it to feel the weight inside. Official paper had its own texture, its own gravity. When she did, the bold header at the top confirmed what her instincts already whispered: a subpoena from the House Oversight Committee, summoning her to testify in Washington. D.C. The words blurred for a second, not because of fear, but because of the recognition that the fight had crossed a new threshold. This was no longer about whispers in a studio, no longer a battle confined to hashtags or breaking news alerts. Congress had entered the arena. Keon, her aide, found her staring at the document at the kitchen table, coffee untouched. He leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, his usual humor replaced by an edge of concern. "This isn't nothing," he said, his voice low, deliberate, as if trying not to break the quiet with panic. Jasmine looked up, meeting his eyes without flinching. "It's not supposed to be nothing," she replied. "If it were nothing, they wouldn't drag me to DI." See, to say it out loud. Her words were calm, but the silence that followed was heavier than any thunder. The news leaked within hours. Cable networks broke into programming with flashing banners. Crockett subpoenaed to testify. Commentators framed it as everything from a historic reckoning to a political trap. Some claimed Jasmine had overstepped, weaponizing personal scandal into national humiliation. Others hailed it as proof that her courage had forced the powerful to pay attention. Either way, the subpoena shifted her position instantly, from the accuser who ignited the blaze to the one now standing in its center, flames licking closer. In her office later that day, the staff buzzed nervously. Phones rang nonstop. Reporters outside shouted for comment, and the building's lobby filled with protesters and supporters alike. Keon dropped a folder on her desk, filled with briefing notes, questions she might face, and a thick section labeled Hostile Interrogation Strategies. She flipped through the pages without pause, almost detached, as though reading about someone else's life. "They're not just asking you to prove what you said," Keon warned. "They're asking you to prove you belong in the room." Jasmine smiled faintly, a tired but resolute curve of her lips. "Then I'll remind them why I walked in the first place." What unsettled her was not the hearing itself, but the way narratives were already being shaped around it. Overnight, pundits began to say she might have orchestrated the chaos for attention. Conspiracy theories bloomed, that the collapse on live television had been staged, that Jasmine had secretly leaked documents herself, that she had built a scandal to secure her own rise. She understood the tactic. It wasn't just about disproving her claims. It was about dismantling her credibility, brick by brick. But there was another current running beneath the noise. Churches organized prayer circles in her name. Retired teachers wrote letters about how courage like hers reminded them of the marches they'd joined decades ago. The hashtags still burned hot, but now they fused into something more solemn, more enduring. Never stand with Jasmine. And so the stage was set, not for a debate in a studio, not for a press conference, but for the cavernous, echoing chambers of Congress itself. She would walk in not as the prosecutor of someone else's secrets, but as the defendant of her own truth. It was a twist as old as politics, truth-tellers being forced to justify their honesty, but Jasmine did not flinch. She folded the subpoena, slipped it back into its envelope, and whispered to herself, "If they want the truth under oath, then let's give it to them." The hearing chamber felt less like a room of lawmakers and more like an arena sharpened for spectacle. The air carried the charge of cameras humming, lenses locked on her every breath, rows of press hunched forward, fingers twitching over keyboards. Spectators packed the back benches, half glaring, half holding their breath. At the center sat Jasmine Crockett, her chair pulled tight against the microphone, the subpoena folded neatly in front of her, as if it were both shield and weapon. The gavel cracked, and within minutes the tone was set. A Republican committee member, his voice sharp with disdain, leaned forward. "This is not about truth. Miss Crockett, this is about revenge. You sought headlines, you sought attention, and now you want this committee to do your bidding." Another followed, almost smirking, as if reading from a script. "Tell us, who benefits more from this than you? You stand on the ashes of someone else's collapse and call it courage? But this looks like nothing more than a vendetta." The words tumbled one after another, designed less as questions and more as accusations. Their cadence was deliberate. Wear her down, make her appear defensive, push her into anger. Across the dais, Democrats tried to interject, but the chair gave no quarter. It became clear this was a performance, carefully choreographed to frame Jasmine not as a truth-teller, but as an opportunist. Yet she did not answer immediately. Instead, she listened, her chin steady, her hands folded before her. The attacks came in waves, one calling her reckless, another claiming she endangered the dignity of the chamber. The crowd shifted, restless, waiting for her to snap back, to match fire with fire. But Jasmine stayed still, absorbing each word as if letting them burn out their own fuel. Finally, and when the crescendo of accusations faltered into silence, she leaned toward the microphone. Her voice, low and even, carried further than the shouting had moments before. "I waited until every claim was verified," she said, each syllable landing like a gavel of its own. "Every detail checked, every fact cross-examined. I didn't come here with rumors. I came here with truth." The effect was immediate. The room, so loud a moment before, stilled as if someone had cut its strings. Even those most eager to pounce hesitated, caught off guard by her composure. Her calm disarmed the aggression that had filled the first half of the hearing. Cameras zoomed in, trying to capture the subtle shift, how the power had suddenly, almost imperceptibly, tilted toward her. For a heartbeat, the chamber felt different. The same Republicans who had barked accusations shuffled their notes, avoiding eye contact. Democrats leaned back, surprised at how quickly she had wrested control without raising her voice. Reporters' fingers froze, then flew again, desperate to capture the moment in real time. It wasn't applause that followed, nor any formal acknowledgement. Instead, it was something rarer. Silence. Not the silence of disinterest, but of unexpected respect. The kind that falls when truth slices through noise like a blade. Jasmine didn't bask in it. She simply adjusted the papers in front of her and prepared for the next volley. The hearing was far from over, but she had marked her ground. The studio lights were sharp, merciless, designed to capture every flicker of expression. Jasmine sat opposite Darlene Rowe, one of the most seasoned political journalists in the country. Rowe was not known for softball questions. Her interviews had the precision of cross-examination, and her audience, older Americans who demanded both rigor and honesty, trusted her to cut through spin. "Did you know it would go this far?" Rowe asked, her tone steady but pointed. The question lingered in the air, hovering between accusation and curiosity. Jasmine didn't flinch. She folded her hands on the desk before her, her gaze fixed, calm but unyielding. "I expected denial," she said after a pause, her voice even but edged with weight. "That's predictable, but what I didn't expect was for her body to do what her words wouldn't." For a moment, Rowe blinked, her reporter's instinct sharpening. "Her body?" Jasmine leaned forward, her tone quieter now, intimate enough that the camera seemed to draw closer on its own. When someone knows the truth but won't admit it, their body betrays them. The hesitation in the voice, the shift in posture, the tightening of the jaw. She couldn't say it out loud, but she said it anyway without meaning to. Rowe was momentarily still, then nodded slowly, her seasoned instinct recognizing the power of the statement. In homes across the country, older viewers, people who had lived long enough to see many kinds of lies, leaned closer to their screens. They knew that body language told truths words couldn't cover. The clip within hours was stripped from the broadcast, clipped into 15 seconds, and scattered across social media. "Did you know it would go this far?" Rowe asked. Jasmine's answer, simple, precise, unforgettable, was replayed again and again. Commentators on both cable news and late-night radio marveled not just at what she said, but how she said it. Calm, without malice, without arrogance. For the first time, the framing shifted. She was no longer being painted as an attacker, a partisan fighter swinging wild blows. Instead, the public began to see her as something different, a symbol of composure under fire, of clarity in chaos. The story stopped being about the accusations hurled at her and became about her ability to stand unmoved while the storm raged. At a diner in Ohio, a retired steelworker shook his head as the clip replayed on the muted television above the counter. "That's not politics," he muttered to no one in particular. "That's truth speaking out of someone's bones." In a church hall in Georgia, a women's Bible study paused to rewatch the viral moment. One woman whispered, She didn't shout. She didn't curse. She just let the silence convict. And in living rooms across the country, older Americans who had seen 1,000 scandals and 1,000 denials recognized something familiar: the difference between noise and truth. The clip became not just evidence of her resilience, but a mirror of something the public yearned for. Someone who didn't need to scream to be heard. By nightfall, the hashtag was everywhere. The body tells. What began as another interview had morphed into a cultural moment. Jasmine Crockett had not only survived the storm, she had redefined it. It started quietly, almost invisibly at first. A mural on the side of a small bookstore in Detroit. An outline of Jasmine's face with the words painted boldly across the brick. "Speak when it matters." Students stopped to take pictures. By the next day, the image had been reposted thousands of times. In Dallas, college forums used her interview as a case study in media literacy. Professors paused mid-lecture, playing the 15-second clip, asking students, "What do you notice? Was it the words or the silence after them?" Debates broke out in lecture halls, not about policy, but about character. In podcasts hosted from kitchens and dorm rooms, young voices replayed the moment like scripture. She didn't shout. She didn't grandstand. She just told the truth and let the silence speak louder. Church pulpits in Birmingham and Baltimore began weaving her line into sermons. "The body tells what the mouth hides," one preacher thundered, and his congregation nodded. Understanding it wasn't just about politics, it was about daily life, about truth that slips out even when denied. Older parishioners left the service, repeating Jasmine's words to one another as if they were proverbs passed down through generations. And then came the unexpected twist: murmurs of acknowledgement from across the aisle. At a town hall in Arizona, a Republican councilman was asked about the controversy. He hesitated, then finally admitted, "Look, I don't agree with her politics, but I'll tell you this: she didn't flinch. And that counts for something." It wasn't a concession of ideology, it was respect. In the highly polarized world of American politics, that small nod was seismic. News outlets seized on it. Even Republicans admit she stood unshaken. The headlines read, "The movement grew not because she forced agreement, but because she embodied something rarer: poise under fire." On campuses, student groups began organizing panels titled "The Silence That Spoke," filling auditoriums with students, retirees, and local activists alike. Call-in radio shows brimmed with callers, truck drivers, nurses, veterans, each repeating their version of the same refrain: "I don't care if you're left or right. That's what strength looks like." Murals multiplied. In Philadelphia, a massive wall painting depicted Jasmine standing against a storm. Her words scrawled beneath, "The body tells the truth." In Los Angeles, teenagers chalked her phrase across sidewalks outside high schools. What had begun as a viral moment was no longer confined to clips on screens. It was physically reshaping landscapes, stitched into the walls, the streets, the rhythm of communities. Even the skepticism that once dominated headlines began to erode. Pundits who had dismissed her as performative found themselves revisiting her interviews, rewatching the pauses, the measured replies. Slowly, reluctantly, they admitted she wasn't chasing spectacle. She was demonstrating control. By the close of that week, the movement had its own identity. It wasn't a campaign. It wasn't a party. It was something subtler, more dangerous to the status quo. A reminder that truth, calmly spoken, could still cut through the noise. And in the background of it all, Jasmine Crockett herself carried on, seemingly unshaken by the tidal wave of attention. But for millions across the country, she had already become more than a politician. She had become a mirror, showing people what it looked like not to flinch. The room was nothing like the hearing chambers or the bright-lit studios where Jasmine had spent the last few weeks. It was a windowless community room in Fort Worth, with folding chairs scraped across the floor, a coffee pot that had gone lukewarm hours ago, and a half-empty tray of store-bought cookies. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, flattening every shadow. This was not the kind of place cameras rushed to capture, but Jasmine had always believed these rooms mattered more than any stage. The meeting was small, maybe 20 people in all, retirees, a few parents with restless toddlers, 2 city workers still in uniforms, and 3 teenagers who had come on their own. The conversation meandered from potholes to housing permits, the kind of ordinary concerns that never made headlines but shaped daily life. Jasmine listened more than she spoke, taking notes in the same worn notebook she'd carried for years. Then came the question that quieted the room. A teenage girl with braids pulled back tight, no older than 16, raised her hand slowly. She didn't sound rehearsed, didn't even look sure of herself as she stood. Her voice wavered but carried enough weight to silence the shuffling chairs. "How do you keep going?" she asked. "When everyone tears you apart?" The room held its breath. An older man coughed softly. A mother adjusted her child's jacket. Jasmine leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees, as though the girl's words deserved her full weight. For a moment, she didn't answer. She simply studied the girl, saw the tremor in her hands, the way her eyes darted around as if bracing for ridicule. Finally, Jasmine spoke in a voice lower, steadier than the room expected. "You don't keep going because it's easy," she said. "You keep going because you decide the tearing apart can't be the last word. Every person who tries to break you is giving you a choice. Do you believe them, or do you believe yourself?" The girl swallowed, her face caught between disbelief and relief. "But what if believing yourself isn't enough?" she whispered. Jasmine nodded slowly, acknowledging the depth of the question. "Then you find someone who holds the belief with you, maybe a friend, maybe a family member, maybe a room like this. We don't survive because we're unbreakable. We survive because we refuse to stay broken." A quiet murmur moved across the group. The retirees exchanged glances. The mother reached for her child's hand. The words weren't grand, but they landed like stones in water, sending ripples outward. The teenage girl finally sat back down, her shoulders a little straighter than before. No applause followed, no viral clip was recorded, but the silence afterward carried its own kind of affirmation. Jasmine let the pause linger before continuing. "The truth is, people will always try to tear you apart," she added, her gaze sweeping the room. "The test isn't whether they succeed, it's whether you let their pieces become your definition. I never have, and I hope you won't either." The civic meeting moved on, back to trash pickup schedules and zoning permits. Yet the question, and Jasmine's answer, hung in the room, heavier than anything else. Folding chairs squeaked. Coffee grew colder. But for the teenage girl, and perhaps for everyone listening, something had quietly shifted. The meeting was already winding down when it happened. People were gathering their coats, stacking the folding chairs back against the wall, and pouring the last drops of cold coffee into flimsy paper cups. The teenage girl who had asked the hard question lingered, her phone in hand. She wasn't planning anything dramatic. She just wanted to remember the moment. She tapped record as Jasmine spoke to a small cluster of attendees still near the front. Jasmine's voice was quiet, meant more for the few in front of her than the world beyond those walls. Yet there was a gravity in her words that seemed to draw the entire room closer. She leaned slightly forward, her notebook resting on the table beside her, and said, "Don't wait for comfort to speak. Speak when it matters, even if your voice shakes." The girl's phone caught it all. The hum of the fluorescent lights, the scrape of a chair leg, the tired but unwavering look on Jasmine's face. There was no microphone, no polished stagecraft, no campaign backdrop. Just truth, spoken plainly in a room that otherwise might have been forgotten. That clip, barely 30 seconds long, was uploaded within the hour. The caption was simple. She said this after everyone left. By the next morning, it had 12 million views. Not because it was flashy, but because it was raw. People weren't hearing a politician. They were hearing someone who sounded like the voice they wished they'd had in their own quiet battles. Veterans shared it, writing about moments when fear silenced them, but duty demanded courage. Churches played it in Sunday services, weaving Jasmine's line into sermons about faith and resilience. Teachers shared it in classrooms, telling students that sometimes the trembling voice carries the most power. In college forums, students debated the meaning of courage, not the absence of fear, but the act of speaking through it. Comment sections filled with stories. A woman from Ohio wrote, "I spoke up to my boss today for the first time in 10 years. My voice shook, but I remembered this." A retired soldier posted, "This line brought me back to the day I told the truth about what I saw overseas. I was shaking too." The echoes were everywhere, from union halls to book clubs, from kitchen tables to late-night podcasts. And strangely, even a few of Jasmine's critics began to concede, albeit grudgingly. One conservative commentator wrote, "I don't agree with her politics, but I can't deny she didn't flinch. That's rare." It wasn't a surrender, but it was something more powerful, an acknowledgement that courage has a language all its own, one that cuts across party lines. Jasmine, meanwhile, didn't watch the numbers climb. She went on with her day, attending meetings and returning calls, barely aware that her quiet remark was reverberating louder than any speech she had given in Congress. For her, it wasn't about going viral. It was about telling the girl with the trembling voice that her fear didn't have to be the end of her story. Yet by the time the sun set, that single trembling truth had reached millions. The world didn't just listen, it carried her words forward. Each share and repost proof that even the quietest room can become the loudest stage. The storm that once seemed endless began to quiet. Headlines about Melania faded. Her appearances grew fewer, and eventually she disappeared from public view altogether. The lawyers who had once crowded around microphones with threats and denials grew silent as investigations concluded. Step by step, Jasmine's evidence was not just acknowledged but validated. Committees released reports, and for the first time in years, Congress passed bills designed to tighten transparency and shine a brighter light into the corners where power liked to hide. It wasn't flashy, and it didn't happen overnight. Reform rarely does, but the change was real. Journalists who had doubted Jasmine's persistence admitted as much. "She didn't just win an argument," one columnist wrote. "She rewrote the rules." And in communities across the country, her line, "Speak when it matters, even if your voice shakes," was no longer just a clip shared online. It was being repeated in classrooms, on banners at rallies, and in sermons from pulpits. The true measure of her impact arrived not in front-page news, but in a small envelope delivered to her office one gray afternoon. Inside was a letter written in careful handwriting from a student in Ohio. The note read simply, "I'm not scared anymore. I spoke up when they told me to stay quiet. My hands were shaking, but my heart felt steady. Thank you for showing me it can be done." Jasmine read it twice, then slipped it into her notebook. She didn't show it off to reporters or staff. She just carried it with her. A reminder that the real victories were measured not in headlines, but in the quiet strength of people who finally found their voices. Meanwhile, Washington insiders continued to speculate about Melania's silence, about whether she would ever attempt a comeback. But outside that bubble, people had already moved on. The story wasn't about Melania anymore. It was about something larger, about a woman who refused to flinch, who chose principle over comfort, and who turned her trembling truth into a movement that others could claim for themselves. At a small gathering back in Texas, Jasmine addressed the crowd. "This was never about taking someone down," she said softly. "It was about lifting us all up, about proving that when you speak, even if you're afraid, you make space for someone else to be brave." The audience didn't cheer wildly. They nodded, some with tears in their eyes. They understood. And that was the final twist. The ending wasn't a collapse, but a rise. Melania's silence faded into the background, while Jasmine's voice became something stronger than a headline, something people carried with them. She had stepped into history not as a politician chasing the last word, but as a symbol of courage for those who thought they had none. In the end, the story closed the way it had always meant to, not with the fall of another figure, but with the rise of a voice that refused to tremble alone. Jasmine had spoken when it mattered, and because of that, millions more now believed they could too.